Good evening, good evening, good evening. We are going live this evening. Thank you for joining us for Unwrapping Math Mastery, a spiraled approach to success. So welcome to our live. Feel free to add your school, location, all of those things in the chat. We're going to give people just a minute to get logged on. It's very nice I hope we see some repeats out here this evening. My name is Jessica Sanchez. I'm one of the program managers with Math-A-Matics tutoring, and we are super excited to have you with us this evening for our mini webinar. It's a little shorter, but we're going to have some great conversations with everyone. So please add your name to the chat. Where are you from? We're going to give people just a minute to add that in before we get started. We'll tell you a little bit about us once I see a few of us live. So please make sure you add your name, your info, your title, all of those things to the chat. We are so excited to be with you this evening. All right, we're going to get moving forward. We're going to give people just 1 minute to join us. Stacy, welcome back. We are excited to see you again. Stacy, we're excited to see you guys again. Our favorite folks in Midland. While we're adding that, just a little bit about us. These are our amazing founders, Kimberly Grant and Don Brown. They are our founders, our directors, our everything. And they started our company a little over 11 years ago with doing the educational consulting. We also provide K through 12 and post-secondary math and science support. That includes instructional coaching, professional development. We do tutoring solutions, and that's online tutoring, but also face-to-face tutoring for schools. But we do online tutoring for private tutoring. And you can see not only do we support schools across this great state of Texas, but we also have Virginia. We're working on a Louisiana project right now. So we have Massachusetts. We support a lot of different people. Kiana, nice to see you again as well. Hope you guys are getting geared up, ready for these last couple weeks before break. So again, I know Stacy and Kiana have joined the chat. My name is Jessica Sanchez, and like I said, I'm one of the program managers with Math-A-Matics tutoring. I do some of the professional development and instructional coaching support. We are looking to do some face-to-face PD here in Houston coming up, so we're going to definitely be dropping some info on that, and make sure you join our mailing list and things like that. Deidre Lawson, our learning and development manager, will be joining in as we go too. And so we are excited to share some information with you guys this evening. Just a quick little webinar to kind of follow up on some of the conversations we had last month. We like to build on our content, and any of these PDs that you see us do online can be extended to a full day or half day, anything like that you might need. So as always, we like to start with our goals and our agenda. We'll talk about some spiraling content defined, some best practices and strategies that can be used. We're going to talk about what kind of data you're looking at when you're spiraling, as well as how to use that data, and then close out with some Q&A. But the important thing, as always, is as we learn and discuss these best practices for spiraling content to reinforce that retention and long-term mastery. We want participation. So you can see we kind of break it into 3 parts for this evening. We're going to start with what is spiraling, talk about the definition and reasons that these supports are needed in the math classroom. We're going to talk about some best practices and strategies to make that happen, as well as what kind of data is going on. But we do want participation. So we are excited. We've got Stacy and Kiana here, and they always bring great conversation to the chat. And I know as we kind of keep going, some people might join on our Facebook, our LinkedIn, our Instagram, our YouTube. We are glad to have you. So just drop that information in the chat as you go so that we know who is here with us. But feel free to join that discussion, because it is our discussion that we have with you guys that just brings out these new topics and ideas and fresh thinking, which is always great. The collaboration piece is huge for what we do. So for this first section, when we're talking about spiraled content for student success and mastery, last month we talked about scaffolding. So we wanted to do just a quick little review. When we talk about it, the recipe to student success begins with the right supports at the right time. So there's times that people will interchange this vocabulary, and we want to make sure to just differentiate a little bit. They both have a piece in making sure students are successful. When we're talking about scaffolding, like we did last month in November, these are temporary supports to help students with those challenging tasks. You're building up to a gradual release where they're able to work more independently, and you're thinking of a staircase that builds upon itself as it goes. Versus spiraling looks more specifically at revisiting those concepts over time, not just to close gaps, but also to strengthen retention, right? As with anything, if we don't practice regularly, it does not become a regular part of our thinking, our habits. And so this helps us build those connections between past learning and also current learning. So as we're spiraling back, we might bring up some concepts and content that's going to help bridge that gap into what we're doing so that students can connect to things they've already known. And we think of that as a spiral. So spiraling is that intentional, and we say intentional because in the classroom, teachers, coaches, you guys know that we have to intentionally build these things into our lesson planning, our small group, everything like that. So spiraling is that intentional revisiting of previously taught content at increasing intervals to strengthen that retention and mastery. So, as we're going through, Deidre, jump on in.
Now, I was going to say spiraling is also where we touch on a lot of the depths and coherency that you'll notice are mentioned in the RBs, those research-based instructional strategies, because it's an opportunity in addition to the scaffolding, but spiraling is an opportunity for you to tie together what students previously learned that year or that month or that week to what it is that is going to be the new learning for the day or what's being introduced to students.
Absolutely. So, you're looking at that data. It might be your current data. It might be historical data. You're planning that integration as you go. You're building activities that allow for this conversation, monitor progress, and then we start over because your progress is your next set of data that you're going to use to move forward. So we like to say you can think of spiraling as decorating a Christmas tree. So your base is that tree, the foundational knowledge and skills. Now we highlight this part here because as we're adding those lights, that's that initial spiral review. We're bringing clarity. We're bringing connections. We're making sure that students understand how these pieces go together or the skills that are needed to be successful. As you go through, we're adding those ornaments for a deeper understanding and complexity, and the star on top is that full mastery. So, as you're spiraling through, what's bringing it all together? What's lighting up these young minds that we're working with in the classroom? Those lights. So as we're spiraling, we're bringing in that content and making sure students are able to see the connections, make those connections, and really dig in deep so they have a core foundation of what we need to do. So when we're talking about why we spiral, it's building that deeper conceptual thinking over time, reinforces skills, and prevents the learning loss. So if you don't use it, you lose it. And so making sure that we are building into digging these skills so that it's not just that thing where they say, I think I've seen that before, but also making sure those connections are between the topics and the real world applications. So spiraling also allows us to say, this is where it can be applied. This is where we can extend. And so remember when we talked about this content, here's what it looks like out there in the real world. So there's a lot of information on this slide, and I don't like to read it right out to you guys, but I know this is some good core understanding about how this closes those knowledge gaps. So, right, everything we do in the classroom as an educator, as an instructional coach, if you're working with those teachers and planning, should be very intentional, right? Because we've got a lot of gaps to close with these kids, and we've got to make sure that we are getting them ready for what they need to do. So as we're going through, the first thing that we're talking about is it reinforces prior learning. Like we've said, if they have those foundational skills that they need to succeed, it also reduces the likelihood of forgetting, thinking about fluency and math facts. We'll talk about those in a little bit with best practices. When we're building those connections across topics, we want to show how concepts relate and also grow in complexity. So when we're spiraling back through, we're allowing them to connect to that previous learning It's also important to do this spiraling because it's going to address that partial understanding, right? Maybe they have that struggle or they've only showed partial understanding. We can clarify the misconceptions because they may have only gleaned a part of what we talked about when we went through the content the first time. So as we're spiraling back through in our small groups, with our centers, things like that, we're able to reinforce those skills. And again, moving it to long-term memory where students can have that recall and apply that prior knowledge, and also just going to make them feel more confident and successful. Deidre?
Yeah, so I wanted to speak a little bit to the addressing the partial understanding and reinforcing partial prior learning. I know that as math teachers, we're always looking for a time where we can go back and do a lesson reteach or go back and revisit a concept that the students may not have shown mastery in. And oftentimes it's hard for us to find a full 1 day lesson or a full class period to be able to do that. With focus and intentional spiraling, you have the opportunity, like you mentioned, to address certain misconceptions and revisit those and make sure students are clear on those small mistakes they may be making in a way that doesn't require you to spend an entire lesson cycle on providing instruction again.
Absolutely. So, as we're going through, if you're in the chat, please let us know some of your current strategies for addressing those students who struggle with the concepts taught earlier in the year. We know that 'tis the season for benchmarks and interim, right? Right now, we are doing those semester exams. We are doing those CBAs, those big benchmarks to show, okay, here's where we're at for mid-year. So what is your current strategy, our ladies in Midland and anyone else who may have joined us, for addressing those students who struggle with concepts you taught earlier in the year? You know, when we talk about anything, like Deidre said, you don't have a full day to cover all this content sometimes or to go back and do a full reteach. So we have to be so intentional with our planning, with what we're building into our lessons so that we're able to hit these marks so our students are going to be successful down the road. So definitely please add to the chat. We love our discussion, and we love what you bring to the table. So let us know your current strategies. And we can use this through our warm-ups, and that's a great place to do this. Centers. And I know, a lot of people stop doing centers or stations in elementary, but you can be very successful with stations and learning stations and independent stations around a middle school or high school classroom, because you can allow the students to pick those skills that they specifically need to spiral back while you're pulling that small group that needs that more specific reteach. And absolutely with our do now. And those do nows are an amazing opportunity to look back at historically weak topics and standards so that you're able to pull in a quick do now to start the day off and make sure we're really digging into that. Thank you, Kiana. So again, abbreviated webinar tonight. Normally we'll do a 45-minute or so, but we're doing a little bit shorter tonight. So we're going to see a couple best practices and strategies, and this would definitely be extended if we're doing this with you in person. And so when we look at instructional best practices, why are some better suited to spiraling? Okay. So we look for practices that can adjust to different learning levels. Like we talked about, certain students are going to need more supports as we go through. We also like to look at practices that require students to connect the concepts, but also apply that critical thinking, because then that's that extension piece, right? And making the connections across content. And also we want to make sure that these are practices that ensure concepts are revisited in meaningful and effective ways. So it's not just repeating what you've already done. It's an intentional reinforcement of the concepts, moving it from that short term to long term. We're going to tailor our spiraling activities to gaps identified. So the data is going to be crucial as we go into part 3, and that's going to help us with that learning outcomes, right? The right strategies, make sure students are spending their time on activities that are going to address their needs, because as individualized as you can get, you're going to get more depth and more progress from all your students and meet those growth measures that we have. So one of the most basic ones that we talk about is working through that fact retrieval, your fluency, your numerical reasoning. Okay. This is strengthening those core math skills, You're adding, subtracting, multiplication, division, and your number patterns. This
So
comes
if we think about like part of that fact fluency or the numerical reasoning, if we're thinking about those concepts that students oftentimes struggle with, especially when they're first introduced. So like in elementary school, that subtraction with regrouping is something that they may struggle with, or that adding where it requires them to carry a number from one place value to the other. If you keep going, when students are first introduced to adding and subtracting fractions, or when seventh graders are first introduced to integer operations, those are things that, just because they are such new concepts in those grades, that the more we can allow them to practice that and to have automaticity around that, the better that they're going to perform in future standards. So that's an example of how fact fluency is one of those good strategies for us to implement when we're discussing spiraling. Of course, that could look like something like the Eureka sprints that are done often, or that could be a practice station to where students are specifically working on integer operations, once a week or something like that, that gives them the opportunity to retain that information and apply it.
And definitely when you're adding in those elements of, with it being decimals, with it being fractions, with it being integers and positive, negative, as we go, if the students don't have that core understanding of the basic fluency period, they're going to be struggling with that piece. So we want to free up that cognitive load so they're not worried about 3 times 3 is 9. They can automatically do that. They just have to remember the rule for this one's a -3, this one's a positive, negative times a positive is a negative, and things like that. Especially as you're digging into word problems and things like that as well. Word problems, with or without models, are a whole other animal. And so if they are strong with their automaticity, with their fact fluency, and how they do their number talks, they're going to feel more comfortable with those word problems. We also think one of the best practices that you can do is with this self-monitoring and self-checking. So we want students to have that accountability, right? We want students to take that ownership of their learning. In the state of Texas, that's one of the ways that you're moving forward with your T-test appraisal, is the more the students are taking that ownership, right? So teaching students to pause, to review, to check their work independently. It could be with a rubric, it could be with a prompt, it could be with a checklist, but allowing the students to take that ownership and accountability. Not only are we building good critical thinkers who can problem solve through a situation, but it also makes sure they're focused on the details, right? And not just rushing through, because they know that they have to take that slow time to slow down and check a rubric, that they have to take that opportunity to make sure they're checking off their checklist.
Previously, you mentioned the workstations being a good consideration for spiraling. So with this self-monitoring and self-checking, especially like after a benchmark assessment or at the conclusion of a unit, doing a self-monitoring or a self-check, having the students conduct that, and then making a determination, based upon how I did on this assessment, I need to go back and revisit or review this concept. And so that self-checking will allow the student to take some ownership or some responsibility in what are those areas that they need to have more intentional practice on.
And the rubrics and everything also provide some of that accountability for that independent work, because when you're working with a small group, you want to make sure the students know what they're doing on their own out there in the classroom so they don't get off task. So kind of moving forward through, when we're talking about using that data to support spiraling, thinking about which data do you use when planning out that content that needs intentional spiral review. And so, when we talk about the instructional items that we're going to use, we're going to pull from those benchmarks, the interim assessments that a lot of states give, and also historical data, because historical data also paints a picture on where the gaps may have been previously. Are they continuing to be weak with that information? Or, if they were weak with it historically, but this year on the benchmark or interim, they're scoring higher, it lets us know, okay, we've mastered and made growth on that. So when
that
you're
historical data also from prior years. So if you're a sixth grade instructor, looking at how those students performed, historically in sixth grade, but also what their data looked like in fifth grade, can give you some insight on where you will probably need to focus some of your spiraling throughout the year. So if you notice that students struggled with adding and subtracting fractions with like denominators the prior year, then the odds of them struggling with adding and subtracting fractions with different denominators is going to be slightly higher. So that might give you an indication that fraction operations is something that you should spiral the whole first 9 weeks or something, so that you know by the time you get to that new concept with fractions this year that they may not struggle as much, or it's giving them some exposure so that when you get to that topic, then it's a little not easier, but student mastery is a little bit more probable if they've been exposed to some of those skills prior to you approaching it.
And absolutely. And then, looking at what the error patterns come in, are the students making the same patterns? Was it a teaching error or a conceptual error, things like that. And so using this data, we can do a lot of different things. And so we're going to pinpoint key areas with our diagnostic data using the baselines to identify where those foundational skill gaps are, because those foundational skills are going to build on all of the word problems that you're working through. They're going to build on all of the more complex concepts that we're doing. We're going to look for those trends and track that skill retention and application. So we should be sprinkling in some of those concepts, especially as we go through the year, to make sure they still have retained what we've taught in August and September. And then also looking
Jessica,
at
when you mentioned the trends, and I know you had the error analysis on the other page, but I think it's important with trends not to just see the percentage of students that got a question correct or incorrect, but also what are those answer choices they're choosing, or even more so, or better practice, how are they working out or how are they approaching the solution to a certain type of problem? Because it's important for you to see what type of mistake is being made. Is it a conceptual mistake? Is it a computational mistake? Where are those mistakes at, so that when you do bring that spiraling back through, then you know what it is that you're focused on and what you need to see from the students when we're spiraling, for them to be able to get past that misunderstanding or that misconception or that frequent mistake that we're seeing.
Absolutely. So it's not just right or wrong. It's where was the error, what type of error it was. And those are great conversations for PLC, which we do a lot of trainings on how to read through data and things like that for PLCs as well. So if we're looking at this,
So
here we,
you want
let's
me
do
to
it
go
like,
through this one? Okay, yeah.
yeah,
So we're talking
absolutely.
a little bit about how do I choose what I need to spiral. So this is just like a short, or a snapshot of a sample seventh grade scope and sequence. I'm sorry, not seventh grade. Is this
Yeah,
fourth grade?
this one's
Fifth
fifth
grade
grade.
scope and sequence. Yeah. So this is just a sample of what potential order of topics might be in a math class. And then to the right in red, you see some sample data again of how students have performed this year on those types of questions. And so when we are trying to think about what to spiral, we want to look at that data in a way to give us some understanding of where to start. So for example, if I look at the data that I'm seeing here, I notice that division of whole numbers is at 43%. So that's something that I know I'm going to want to spiral in future instruction. Now I'm going to have to look at that error analysis, like Jessica mentioned earlier, or look at the question style so I can see when I do choose to spiral, how am I going to present that to students? But this will show me that I probably need to look at division of whole numbers throughout the remainder of the next lesson cycle. Also, if I'm looking at like adding and subtracting fractions, like I was sharing earlier. So this percentage is not bad, 58%, but it's also not great. And so if I'm looking at that data as well, if, for example, I am teaching adding and subtracting fractions specifically, I know that later in this scope and sequence, I'm going to have to address geometry. Fifth graders may have to find the area of something or the perimeter of something that requires them to add fractions together to get the answer. And so if I'm noticing already that they're performing lower in adding and subtracting fractions, that's something that I'm going to want to revisit with students, because computationally, that's going to come back up in word problems. It's going to come back up in geometry. It may come back up again in central tendencies later in the semester. But we want to look topic based first, like where are our students struggling, and then we can drill down into that error analysis and other things to see how we need to present that information to the students, or what stimulus do the students need to be engaged in when we spiral this back.
Well, and like you said, multiplying whole numbers and division of whole numbers, 55% and 43. There's definitely got to be some gaps with those students. And if we say this is week 10 data, coming up, we've got multiplication and division of fractions. Then we're going to be doing measurements and conversions of units. All of those rely on multiplication and division. And so if we're not ready with our basic whole numbers, we're going to have that confusion as we move forward. So definitely making sure that we include that as we move forward with the scope and sequence. And so as we're kind of going through, we're looking at ways how and when we can spiral through. So if we're talking about with our homework, we could say this is allowing students to revisit those prior topics while practicing new content. So maybe 2 to 3 frequently missed problems from a previous lesson, and including some foundational skills, but also some advanced questions so that we make sure not only are we reinforcing those skills, but also checking to see where they're moving forward to be level of test writing. Centers and stations provide that targeted low pressure practice with small groups. So one of the most important stations you can have, especially from elementary all the way up, I would even say through middle school, is centers designed for fluency, looking at those numerical operations or automaticity. Because it, like we said on the last slide, it hits in so many areas when you're talking about area perimeter, when you're doing conversions. If they don't have that fact fluency and automaticity, it's going to be much more of a struggle for them to work through those. And then we also maybe would include a rotation center for highly tested standards that are the most missed. Deidre?
No, that's what I was going to touch on in regards to those highly tested standards, and bringing those back in as often as possible, giving those students an opportunity to practice those misconceptions or those common errors. We also talked about spiraling through the use of technology. So there's a few different ways that that can look. I know I know we talked a little bit about several of the software online programs that we have. I know there's Zern, there's IXL, there's ST You can use those programs to spiral, especially to individualize the learning that needs to take place for certain students, because it's also adaptive. And so if you know of something, or if you know of a topic where students have historically struggled, or a topic where students have shown earlier in the year that they've struggled, you can assign those things to them in those centers throughout the year until they're showing that they have mastery consistently on that. I know, Ms. Sanchez, so we talked a little bit about also having a flipped classroom. You may assign students a certain thing to review at home, and a video to watch or to review, and then there's something that they need to bring back to class the following day during an extended break. That's a great time to do that. If you're on a spring break or on a winter break and there's a topic you want them to revisit, doing something with a flipped classroom would also be ideal in that type of situation.
Absolutely. A quick little flip video, if they review it the evening before and they come into the classroom ready with their questions on the concepts, it saves you some of that teaching time where you're able to move more into targeted supports and small groups, things like that. And then anything with quizzes and exit tickets, warm ups, also like a few of you mentioned earlier with this, is incorporating those old concepts helps them maintain the mastery. So it could be from a
And
warm up, a quiz, or an exit ticket.
on those quizzes or those assessments, especially in the secondary grades, and I'm sure elementary kids would appreciate it too. If you put a section, or 3 or 4 questions at the end of every quiz or assessment that is reviewing prior knowledge, one, you'll ensure that students are able to practice those concepts, but two, several of your students will also thank you because they're able to answer questions that they have had prior exposure to and practice. And so sometimes students will see that those questions will assist their grade, especially if the majority of the test is a new concept. And then I know that these 3 or 4 questions are from prior learning for me to practice. You give students an opportunity to increase their scores on those assessments as well.
And so, one more discussion question before we get to the wrapping up portion is, how do you ensure the data that you use for spiral review effectively addresses the needs of all learners, including those who require additional scaffolding. So last month we talked a little bit about scaffolding. We touched base on spiraling, and these two together can be extended for a full day training, half day training, things like that, more specifically for your campus or district needs. But think about, how do you ensure that data you use effectively addresses the needs? So please drop it in the chat. Add your opinions, your 2 cents, as we get ready to wrap up for the day. So definitely let us know. There's just a lot of different things that get thrown at teachers when we talk about data. And so these are good conversations if you have an effective PLC going, that you can look at things like the exit ticket from the week before, look at your benchmark data, even your historical data to compare. Okay, we've got our benchmark for this year and it says our kids are doing this on number operations. Let's pull up their last year's state exam and see, were they this low last year? Is it something in the way that the teachers are explaining it? Doing some vertical planning where the fourth grade teachers might explain the way they taught it. And so the fifth grade teachers can pull in some of that similar vocabulary so students can make connections as well as they spiral back through.
And I think also some of those more intermittent or informal checks for understanding can also be used to assist with identifying what we need to spiral with. So a lot of that aggressive monitoring that you're doing during during a day-to-day lesson, or when you're doing your teacher small group and you're identifying certain things that you notice with the students' computation or approach to a problem, those are things that you can spiral into the learning the following class period, or 2 days later. It doesn't always have to be after a major assessment. You can make those adjustments based on what you're seeing in one class to the next and spiral that learning back in as well.
Great. Kiana added to the chat. She says if it's 50% or lower, that's when their district chooses to reteach the whole group. But if it's higher than 50%, they're going to pull those small groups based on the TEAC standards that they have, which is a great plan. And like
Yes,
Deidre mentioned
that's a great
earlier,
best practice.
the accountability with the students, especially when you get to middle school and beyond. But even I've seen fourth or fifth graders be really successful with this, creating a rainbow chart, coloring in the teaks that they got right with green, and then making sure the other ones that they missed, maybe partial, was yellow, so they can know which lessons to log into. They can know which center packets to pull, making sure that they're checking there and having that accountability piece as well. Thank you for
Their
sharing.
own little personal heat map.
I love it. It's one of the most fun things we used to do at the campus, where the campuses where we were where I was a specialist, was those little rainbow charts, and they all had their own rainbow charts. And even the front of a benchmark had all the teaks written on it so they could color it in as they got them. So, kids like that. Kids like to see that they're growing. So, kind of wrapping up for this evening, like I said, it's a little bit shorter, but we are definitely looking forward to more of these in the future. And also, hopefully, some of you joining us in person in January as we prepare a face-to-face training. And Kiana, Miss Stacy, maybe we'll find a way to get you guys a login as well so you can join us from Midland, even though you're not here in Houston. But so with our webinar, we're going to reinforce the learning by revisiting those concepts over time, which is going to strengthen those foundational skills. And when we're looking for our best practices, we've got to tailor our activities to fit your classroom needs, the intervention needs, and really making sure that we're focusing on that progression. Just like we kind of did with scaffolding, we're going from simple to complex, right? So scaffolding is providing the supports along the way. Spiraling is making sure we are pushing. Oh, and I like this. Kiana said they also have a checklist for IXL that they add. And Kiana, I promise you, we will reach out for when we plan that training and see what we can do to get you virtually joining us. And then also just using that data to support our spiraling, analyzing the benchmarks and interim assessments and the historical data to create those plans. So kind of, we've mentioned it a few times, we do a lot of professional trainings. We also do some instructional coaching. We are here to support what your district, your campus needs. Also, we provide that tutoring support. So that's another just service that Math-A-Matics puts out there for you guys. So please, I know Kiana and Stacy, you guys have this information. Anyone else that's joined us, please make sure you get our information to reach out. We can tailor a support based on what you guys need. But definitely, we have enjoyed these webinars that we've been doing these once a month, about once a month, I think, Deidre, right? We've been doing one.
Yes, yes, yes.
And
And on
so,
the Let's Keep in Touch, just real quick before you close out, one of the things that we've noticed, especially during this time of year when we return back from winter break, is revisiting what that scope and sequence looks like for second semester based on
mhm,
all the first semester data points that you brought together and identifying, do I still need to spend this amount of time on these particular units or concepts, or do I need to make some adjustments? Also looking at it from which of the concepts that we have coming up second semester lend themselves well to revisiting some of those prior skills. For example, we discussed, with geometry and measurement, we know they're adding and subtracting and multiplying anytime it comes to, geometry and measurement. So can I bring back in my decimal operations, my fraction operations? Integers may not make as much sense on the negative side, but looking at where it makes sense holistically before you begin that second semester, so it's not as much of a stretch trying to figure out where you can embed certain concepts. So sometimes that can just be like a planning session, a half day or a full day planning session where we take some time looking at your data and looking at the scope and sequence for the second semester. So if that's something that you think would be helpful or that you all may be interested in, please let us know. It's one of my favorite things to talk about is data.
oh yeah, it's the data conversations are so eye opening sometimes, and definitely to let the teachers know, hey, this is where you're at, and here's the progress we're making, or just to show the growth from last year to now can really just push that second semester in the right direction. So we can definitely assist with anything like that that you might need, PLC planning,
And we
anything.
know that the STAR test has moved back into April, I believe. So,
Mhm.
that second semester is not as long as it was last year. Be mindful.
Okay, and so we are wrapping up this evening, but like we said, we look forward to having you join us on future webinars. Most of our trainings are, you can find them on our YouTube, our Facebook, on our, if you scroll back through, we have these live streams also if you want to share them with anyone so they can join us in the future as well. We appreciate just your time, your participation, all of those things, and we do wish you a restful holiday break, but please know, grab our information because we will be working over the break. So if you need us in January, we'll be ready to go. Deidre, anything else?
No, thank you all so much. As Jessica touched base on earlier, in today's webinar, we will be offering a January PD on just, new millennial math instruction and what that looks like and as it relates to those best practices, how we're responding to the AI movement, how we're responding to the STAR 2.0. So we're really excited to present that. This is, I say, a new training that we've put together, but you'll hear some of the, some of our tried and true best practices and strategies there too also. But very hopeful that you all will be in attendance for that and start looking for some information on that a little over the next couple of weeks.
All right. You guys have a great evening. Enjoy your break in a few weeks. And again, if you need us, feel free to reach out now because we will be ready to support when you guys come back in January. Have a great evening, and we will see you back in January.